Have you ever wondered why some people keep returning to the very thing that destroys them, even when they clearly know the price they will have to pay afterward? Why would someone risk their health, relationships, and stability just to repeat a behavior that has already proven harmful? This question has accompanied humanity for a long time, and perhaps the answer is far more complex than we usually imagine at first glance. The most common explanation is usually simple and direct. Many times we hear that addiction happens because of a lack of willpower, weakness of character, or absence of personal control. This narrative feels comfortable because it creates a sense of distance between those who observe and those who suffer from the problem. But some thinkers began to realize that this interpretation might be ignoring something much deeper about human nature. The psychologist Carl Jung and the physician Gabor Maté arrived at a conclusion that completely changes this perspective. For them, addiction rarely begins with the substance itself. It begins much earlier, in a quiet territory of the mind where unresolved emotional experiences continue to influence the way someone tries to deal with their own pain. What appears to be the problem may actually be only the visible symptom of something much older. The way society usually understands addiction tends to follow two different paths. Either it is treated as a moral failure, or it is explained only as a chemical disease of the brain. Although these interpretations contain parts of the truth, Jung and Maté suggest that both leave something important out. Perhaps the more relevant question is not why someone becomes addicted, but what kind of suffering that person is trying to relieve. Because many times what we call addiction does not begin with the pursuit of pleasure, but with the attempt to escape a pain that seems impossible to endure. Throughout this video, we will explore this deeper perspective on the psychology of addiction. And if reflections like this awaken your curiosity about the human mind, consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, and turning on notifications to continue exploring these invisible layers of the psyche. For many years working with people facing severe addiction, the physician Gabor Maté began to notice a pattern that rarely appears in common explanations about addiction. Behind compulsive behavior, there was almost always something older and quieter. It was not only about substances or destructive habits, it was about stories of emotional pain that began long before any contact with what would later be called addiction. When we hear the word addiction, the tendency is to imagine someone dominated by a specific substance or behavior. But Maté proposed a different question, a question that completely changes the perspective. Instead of asking why someone uses a drug or repeats a habit, he suggested asking something much deeper. What exactly is this person trying to relieve within themselves? When he examined these stories more closely, he noticed something that repeated itself with surprising frequency. Many people struggling with addiction carried difficult experiences from childhood. Unstable family environments, emotional neglect, psychological abuse, or the absence of emotional connection. These experiences do not simply disappear with time. They transform into silent marks that continue influencing how the mind responds to suffering. This type of pain does not always appear in dramatic or visible ways. Most of the time it emerges as a persistent feeling of internal discomfort, a sense of emptiness that is difficult to explain. A person may continue living, working, and maintaining relationships, yet there is a constant restlessness in the background of the mind. Something seems to be missing, even when everything on the outside appears to function normally. It is within this emotional landscape that the first encounter with something that promises relief often occurs. It may be alcohol, drugs, food, pornography, social media, or any activity capable of temporarily changing the state of the mind. At first, it does not seem dangerous. On the contrary, it may feel almost like an unexpected solution to a discomfort that previously had no explanation. Suddenly, that constant pressure of emotional tension begins to soften. The mind slows down, thoughts become quieter, and the body relaxes for a few moments. For someone who has spent years carrying an internal weight that feels difficult to bear, this experience can feel deeply liberating. It is not necessarily about seeking intense pleasure, but about experiencing a rare moment of psychological rest. This temporary relief is exactly what makes the experience so powerful. For the first time in a long while, the person finds a quick way to interrupt the pain they had been carrying silently. The brain carefully records this change of state. It learns that something in the environment is capable of reducing the suffering that once felt unavoidable. Over time, this association begins to strengthen. Whenever emotional pain returns, the mind remembers what previously brought relief. The behavior stops being an occasional experience and gradually becomes an emotional strategy. The substance or activity starts functioning like a kind of psychological anesthesia. At this point, many people believe the problem is simply a lack of discipline or weakness of character. However, reality is usually far more complex. The human organism naturally seeks to reduce suffering and restore some internal balance. When someone has not learned other ways to deal with pain, repeating what provides relief becomes almost inevitable. This understanding profoundly changes the way we see addiction. Instead of seeing only a self-destructive behavior, we begin to perceive an attempt at emotional survival. The habit may be harmful, but it often emerged as an improvised way to cope with feelings that seemed too overwhelming to face directly. Many people living with addiction describe exactly this experience. They are not necessarily chasing constant euphoria. They are trying to escape emotions that feel overwhelming when they appear. Deep anxiety, persistent loneliness, or a constant sense of inadequacy can create a psychological weight that feels almost impossible to carry without some form of relief. That is why different individuals can develop completely different addictions. For some, the path involves alcohol or drugs. For others, it may appear in excessive work, social media, or seemingly ordinary compulsive behaviors. The object changes, but the function remains the same, temporarily altering the internal state of the mind. When we look only at the substance or the behavior, we are observing only the surface of the phenomenon. The real story is usually hidden within the emotional experiences that shape that person throughout life. Without understanding this deeper dimension, any attempt at a solution risks treating only the symptom while ignoring the origin of the pain. And it is precisely here that the reflection begins to deepen even further. Because if emotional pain can remain hidden within the mind for so many years, an inevitable question arises. Where do all the emotions go that we cannot face, understand, or express? According to Carl Jung, they do not disappear. They accumulate silently in a psychological territory he called the shadow. Carl Jung believed that the human mind is not formed only by the parts we show to the world. There is also a silent and often ignored dimension of the psyche, where emotions, impulses, and memories that we learn to hide are stored. Jung called this inner territory the shadow. It is not necessarily evil, but it contains everything that, out of fear or shame, we cannot consciously recognize within ourselves. From a very early age, we learn that some emotions are acceptable while others should be hidden. Children who express anger may be reprimanded. Children who show sadness may be ignored. Gradually, these emotions begin to be pushed inward as if they were not welcome. The problem is that what is repressed does not disappear. It simply stops being visible to conscious awareness. As the years pass, these unresolved emotions continue to exist deep within the psyche. Shame, abandonment, fear, insecurity, or a sense of inadequacy may remain there, silent, waiting for some form of recognition. The conscious mind tries to move forward, but the unconscious continues carrying these experiences like a psychological pressure that has never truly been released. Jung observed that everything we fail to make conscious eventually finds other ways to express itself. Sometimes it appears in dreams, other times in repetitive behaviors that seem difficult to explain. When an emotion remains repressed for a long time, it can begin influencing our choices indirectly, guiding a person toward patterns that feel almost inevitable. It is at this point that addiction often begins to take on a quiet role in someone's life. The substance or behavior does not arise merely as pleasure or entertainment. It emerges as a kind of internal pause. A moment when the emotional noise coming from the shadow seems to soften for a few moments, creating a temporary feeling of relief. For someone who has carried unresolved emotions for many years, this experience can feel deeply seductive. During that brief period, the mind no longer needs to deal with painful memories, feelings of rejection, or self-critical thoughts. The psychological silence that appears can feel almost therapeutic, even though it is only a temporary effect. The problem is that this silence does not resolve the original cause of the suffering. The pain that was pushed into the shadow continues to exist, waiting to be recognized. When the effect of the substance fades, the emotions return with the same intensity, sometimes even stronger. This creates a quiet cycle in which the person repeats the behavior just to restore that brief moment of relief. Jung described this phenomenon with a phrase that became one of the most well-known ideas in depth psychology. He said that what does not become conscious eventually manifests as destiny. In other words, when we refuse to look at our inner wounds, they continue influencing our choices without us clearly realizing what is happening. This insight reveals something deeply important about the nature of addiction. Often, the compulsive behavior is not merely a bad habit that needs to be eliminated. It may be a sign that something within the psyche is trying to draw attention. A forgotten emotion, an old pain, or a rejected part of one's identity that is still seeking recognition. When we begin to look at addiction through this psychological lens, the question changes once again. Instead of asking only how to eliminate the behavior, we begin asking what it might be trying to communicate. What kind of emotion or inner experience is attempting to emerge through that repetitive pattern that seems so difficult to interrupt? This kind of reflection can feel uncomfortable at first, because it requires looking at parts of one's personal history that may have been avoided for a long time. But it also opens the possibility of understanding something essential. Perhaps addiction is not only an enemy to be fought, but also a signal that there is a part of the psyche that needs to be heard. This process of recognition is exactly what Jung called the integration of the shadow. It means allowing repressed emotions to be seen, understood, and eventually transformed. It is not a quick or simple path, but it can be a fundamental step in dissolving the internal pressure that often feeds compulsive behaviors. Interestingly, many people report that simply beginning to recognize these emotions already creates an important shift. When pain stops being completely ignored, it slowly begins to lose some of the power it once held over the mind. What once felt like an invisible weight starts to take shape, and with that recognition comes the possibility of understanding. And perhaps it is worth pausing for a moment to reflect on this. How many emotions throughout life have been silenced because they felt too difficult to face? If you would like to share, write in the comments. What feeling do you think people try the hardest to hide within themselves? This question leads us directly to something even more intriguing, the psychological cycle that turns this inner silence into dependency. After the behavior of relief takes hold, something even more complex begins to happen within the mind. Addiction stops being only an occasional response to suffering and begins forming a psychological cycle that is difficult to notice while it is happening. Each stage of this process seems to temporarily solve the pain, but at the same time it creates the exact conditions for that pain to return even stronger afterward. Everything usually begins with an uncomfortable emotion that appears seemingly without warning. It may be anxiety, loneliness, a feeling of inadequacy, or a difficult-to-explain sense of emptiness. The mind tries to deal with this internal state, but when a person does not have sufficient emotional resources to process that pain, the impulse arises to seek something that can quickly change the way they feel. At that moment, something the brain has learned before comes into play. The memory of an experience that once brought relief appears almost automatically. It may be a substance, an activity, or any stimulus capable of temporarily altering the emotional state. The promise is not lasting happiness, but simply a brief pause in the middle of discomfort. When the person turns to this behavior, the brain releases chemical substances associated with reward and relief. For a few moments, the emotional pressure decreases. The body relaxes, the mind slows down, and the feeling that once seemed overwhelming loses intensity. For someone who constantly lives under internal tension, this moment can feel deeply comforting. The problem is that the relief does not last long. As soon as the effect fades, emotional reality returns. Often it comes back accompanied by something even heavier: guilt, shame, or self-criticism. The person realizes they repeated a behavior they promised to avoid, and this realization creates a new type of psychological suffering that adds to the previous one. At this point, the cycle begins to close. The original pain is still present, but now it is accompanied by additional feelings of failure or inadequacy. The mind tries to deal with this combination of uncomfortable emotions, and once again the memory of what previously brought relief appears. The behavior repeats itself, not for pleasure, but because it seems like the only known escape. Over time, this process begins to operate almost automatically. The brain starts associating emotional suffering directly with the need for escape. The more often the cycle repeats, the stronger this association becomes. Gradually, addiction stops being merely a habit and begins transforming into a deeply rooted pattern within the mind. This mechanism helps explain why many people say they feel as if they have lost control over their own behavior. In reality, what has happened is the formation of an extremely reinforced psychological circuit. Each repetition strengthens the link between emotional pain and the relief behavior, making the cycle increasingly difficult to interrupt consciously. Carl Jung believed that repetitive patterns like this are rarely just accidents of life. They often reveal inner conflicts that remain active within the psyche. When an emotion has not been understood or integrated, it continues searching for ways to express itself. Compulsive behavior often becomes one of these indirect forms of expression. That is why simply removing the substance or behavior does not always completely solve the problem. The emotional pain that fueled the cycle continues to exist within the person. If they do not find new ways to deal with that pain, the mind tends to search for other paths to produce the same type of relief that once came from the addiction. This dynamic also helps explain something that frequently generates social misunderstanding. Many people believe that those struggling with addiction continue using substances simply because of irresponsibility. However, when we observe the complete psychological cycle, we realize that the behavior often functions as a desperate attempt to relieve internal suffering. Unfortunately, society's reaction often reinforces this cycle even further. Judgment, rejection, or punishment can intensify the feelings of shame and isolation that the person already carries. Instead of dissolving the pain that sustains the addiction, these responses may deepen it, strengthening the very psychological mechanism that keeps the behavior active. This does not mean that a person is condemned to remain trapped in this process. It simply means that the path toward transformation requires something deeper than the simple repression of the behavior. It involves understanding the emotions that feed the cycle and developing new ways of dealing with them without returning to the same repetitive pattern. When this understanding begins to emerge, something interesting happens inside the mind. The behavior stops appearing as an inexplicable mystery and starts being seen as part of an understandable psychological mechanism. This shift in perspective can open space for a different question, a question that often marks the beginning of real transformation. Perhaps that is why it is so interesting to hear the stories of people who have already faced this cycle. Often there is a moment when something inside the person changes perspective. If you would like to share your thoughts, write in the comments. In your opinion, what is the hardest part to break in a cycle of addiction? The substance itself, or the emotional pain behind it? When we begin looking at addiction through this deeper lens, an unexpected possibility appears. What once seemed like pure destruction may also reveal a quiet call for inner transformation. And it is exactly in this understanding that a final question begins to arise for many people. If addiction is born from pain, what happens when that pain finally finds space to be understood? When we look at addiction through the ideas of Carl Jung and Gabor Maté, something begins to change profoundly in the way we understand this phenomenon. Addiction stops appearing as merely a destructive behavior that must be eliminated at any cost. It also begins to be seen as a psychological signal, an imperfect attempt to deal with something inside the person that remains wounded, silent, and still searching for some form of emotional survival. This does not mean minimizing the devastating consequences that addiction can cause. The losses are real and often too painful to ignore. But this perspective invites us to go beyond the surface of behavior and look at what came before it. Because behind many self-destructive patterns, there is often a story of emotional pain that never truly found space to be understood or acknowledged. Perhaps that is why Jung and Maté invite us to make a simple but deeply transformative shift in the way we ask our questions. Instead of asking, "Why is this person addicted?" maybe the more human question is another one. What happened to this person? What kind of experience, suffering, or emotional emptiness turned addiction into a way of trying to survive their own inner reality? This shift in perspective does not solve everything instantly, but it can open an important door to understanding, empathy, and transformation. And perhaps it is worth reflecting on this together. In your opinion, what keeps someone trapped in addiction the most? The substance itself, or the emotional pain that often remains hidden behind it? If you would like to share your thoughts, leave your reflection in the comments. Conversations like this help expand our understanding of the human mind. And if content like this sparks your curiosity about depth psychology, human behavior, and the mysteries of the mind, consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, and turning on notifications. That way you can continue following new reflections that explore these invisible layers of the psyche. After all, sometimes understanding human pain is also one of the most powerful ways of understanding ourselves.